Buenas tardes, todos. That's all the Spanish that I have for you today. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nanjala Nyabola. We are only halfway into January, and the first big tech crisis of the year is already here. You might have seen that Grok, the AI software built into the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, has been allowing users to make and disseminate non-consensual sexual images of women and children. Some countries have threatened to sue, others have threatened new laws, and in response, Grok has placed this functionality behind an $8 a month paywall, only making it available in some countries and not others. The problem hasn't been solved. It's only been moved behind a paywall and in jurisdictions where people are not likely to notice. I have 15 minutes to convince you that the outcomes that what we're seeing in the Grok scandal, are not an accident. In fact, I think they are a product of some of the foundational ideas of why and how we build and deploy technology. Things like surveillance tech, systemic violence against women and children being accepted as a necessary consequence of digital development. I think these are philosophical problems, not technical problems. And if we want to solve them, then we have to change our philosophical foundations. For a long time, the orthodoxy was digital technology was the solution, and human beings were the problem. If any issues came up, then we, the humans, would have to adapt. We embraced the narrative that if we could somehow throw digital technology at anything that we could frame as a problem, we should. And if we did this, then we would have a more efficient and innovative future. But terrible things keep happening on the road to this shared digital future. As I've mentioned, digital violence against women has been normalized as an acceptable cost to building digital technologies. The response to abuse and threats of harm against women on social media is to tell women to ignore it, to log off. Just ignore it. When tech companies launched generative AI as the next frontier in digital technology, every woman that I know had the same reaction. This is going to be used to cause harm. And so this week, when we see men using Grok to create some of these non-consensual images, the weak response of putting it behind a paywall tells us that for these companies, for this company, this is simply not a priority. At the same time, we have to think about the human element. Whose labor makes these digital technologies possible? When I say tech workers, and I ask you to think about who is a tech worker, most of us will think about computer engineers, maybe a project manager or two. But behind all of the mass use of technology that's available today are low-wage, exploited workers in what are, in effect, sweatshops. These workers train and they clean up AI models by subjecting themselves to hours and hours of the ugliest and most violent content that human beings can produce. Because if we left these generative AI models that are built on sucking up content that's available on the internet, if we left them to their own devices, they would, like Microsoft's ChatGPT, in a matter of days, become racist, sexist, and dangerous. At the same time, think about things like Amazon Go, which was supposed to be the future of independent shopping. In fact, it was revealed to be low-wage workers in India watching people on surveillance cameras and tallying up their shopping before they left the shops. We also have the physical labor of producing the raw materials that go into our digital development. Miners who have to dig deeper and deeper every year in search of the rare earth minerals that make semiconductors and batteries for electric vehicles possible. Digital technologies don't happen in the cloud. There is very real human labor at every level that makes this so-called cloud possible. And yet these workers are not only poorly compensated, they're very rarely acknowledged. This is part of this myth that our shared digital future has no material reality. It's hard enough to get people to think about digital infrastructure, the fiber optic cables, the satellites that litter our night sky. It's harder still to get them to understand that every single query that is run through a generative AI model, every time you quote-unquote ask ChatGPT, half a liter of water is wasted. Even harder, it's to get people to think about the environmental reality of data centers, the air pollution, the spikes in the cost of electricity for those who live in the communities where these data centers are. In exchange for the promise of an easier and a more efficient future, we have accepted the complete disconnect from the fact that the cloud is actually here on Earth with us, and that there are communities and people who are paying for that cloud with their health. As I said, I don't think that these and other negative outcomes are accidental. And I also don't think that we address these problems if we don't ask radical questions. And I'm using the word radical here in the sense in which it is linguistically intended. That means going to the root, thinking beyond the superficial phenomenons and the technical fixes to what lies beneath. These are not questions about method and engineering and other choices. These are questions about ontologies and epistemologies and philosophies that guide the way in which the world around us is organized. In my research, I argue that these outcomes are a product of an individualist philosophy, an idea of personhood in which the survival of the I is more important than the survival of the we. Our purpose as human beings in this philosophical construct is to consume, to extract, to ensure our individual survival, and maximize our capacity to extract and accumulate. Beyond just calling it capitalism or neoliberalism, there is an underlying belief that the human being is not connected to the world around them. Instead, they loom over it, almost like a ghost, naming, ordering, subjecting, surviving, and then exiting, with no thought about the generations that will have to inhabit the planet after them. Is there an alternative to this philosophy? Is our digital future, are all of these things as inevitable as the people who build them are telling us? I think there is. And in my work, I propose one that begins with thinking about the intellectual contributions, the lives and the experiences of African women, people who use their agency and their creativity to define their relationship to power in a system that often is unseeing of that agency and that creativity. You've heard of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. A tradition that keeps the I at the center of what it means to exist and what it means to be. But in other societies and other communities, there are other people at the center. In fact, it is the we who are at the center. And the we doesn't just refer to the people who exist today. We are thinking about future generations. We are thinking about the obligations that we have to be good ancestors to those who will come after us. Specifically, I look at the writings and teachings of African women because there is a long history there of theorizing and pushing back against approaches to power that refuse to see intersectional identities. This work exists in a variety of spaces. It's in mining, in agriculture, in forestry, in economics, in law. But all of this is united by challenging the orthodoxy and pushing back against this idea of inevitability. I think about scholars like Sylvia Tamale, whose critical interrogations of both traditional and modern law in Uganda has produced a distinct idea about what it means to be a person. Uganda is a country that inherited a colonial legal system that said that not only were Africans inferior, but African women were so inferior that they were not entitled to vote until the 1970s. What does it mean to practice law in a legal system like that? What does it mean to stand before a judge and defend your client before a system like that? In thinking through some of these questions, Tamale has developed a distinct ontology of personhood that I argue can be transferred to different contexts to help us think about what it means to be a person in the digital age. Indeed, since before our countries existed in Africa, African women have had to write themselves into politics, into society. And this has produced a body of work that I call, and many of us call, African feminism, which, because of its focus on justice, on equality, and on freedom, can give us a rich body of knowledge that we can use to theorize a different technological future. I make this point by going back to the example of the environmental consequences of generative AI. Given that the vast majority of African women are subsistence agriculturalists, we spend a lot of time thinking about our relationship to nature. If you had to walk 300 kilometers in search of water to drink, you wouldn't build anything in your immediate environment without thinking about what it meant to protect water, to defend water. Professor Wangari Maathai, who was the first and so far the only African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, she spent her entire life arguing that there could be no social, no economic progress without protection of the earth, and that our economic models must contemplate interdependence with the natural environment to be valid. There is no demand and supply that does not contemplate the impact that that demand and supply has on the natural environment. The earth cannot be an afterthought. So using this philosophical approach, when we think about AI, we have to ask ourselves, is the current approach complete? Would you consider a car to be complete if it didn't have an engine? Would you consider a car to be complete if it didn't have doors? You probably wouldn't. So why do we think that a business, engineering, technical model to developing artificial intelligence that does not consider the very grave consequences to the natural environment can be considered progress, can be considered innovation? This is just one example of a larger body of work that makes one core point. We need radically different, expansive, and inclusive sources of knowledge about how our digital future will be shaped. I'm using the example of African feminist thought here to show how impactful embracing the idea that there is more knowledge out there than we are currently sitting with, how impactful that can be, how generative it can be, how much it can shift our ethical frameworks. And there is so much more to the world. Think about it as a potato. When I say potato, most people in the world will think about the Irish potato, because that's the most common and that's the most economically viable type of potato there is. But here in South America, in neighboring Peru, you have 3,000 varieties of potato. We've been limiting ourselves to eating one type of potato when we could have been having 2,999 others. Our ideas of what a potato is and why it matters should be bigger than the lines we have drawn across our lives. Similarly, our ideas about what ethical frameworks should guide our shared digital future should not be limited by our inability to look over across the limitations that exist between us and think together beyond these lines to a positive, inclusive, shared digital future. Thank you very much.